One of the least charming features of modern politics and modern democracies is how reactive the political class is. It seems almost unimaginable that we would have grand visions for the future from our political leadership, and I guess we don't really seek it, which does come with some benefits, but one of the obvious costs is that we're not very good at taking the large-scale shifts that we need to in response to some problems. And one really tedious part of this is that when we do have sudden problems that emerge, rather than being able to deal with them commensurately as part of some sort of greater vision or greater framework, we have rapid response band-aids or attempts at fixes that often only exacerbate the problem. This is obvious across a whole host of things that are happening right now. I mean, in Australia, you could look at how we're responding to the inevitable rising fuel prices from the Iran war by cutting a fuel excise rather than shoring up long-term stability of fuel sources, or even, God forbid, actively opposing the war that America and Israel are leading there. Same is true for healthcare. We have a demographic shift where obviously we have a lot more older people and a lot fewer younger people paying the taxes for that, and that's going to cost more money. Rather than have a structural shift, we just sort of tack on an Medicare levy into people's taxes, so people are sort of surreptitiously paying directly. When there are big bushfires, we shift around our resources everywhere to help everyone, say with floods, and then we rebuild in exactly the same places without adequate long-term plans for what it is for people to live in floodplains and high-risk fire zones. When you look across the arc of time, those type of events become certainties, but we just deal with them in the short-term cycles. And that's part of short-term politics. It's part of low incentives for politicians to deal with them. And like I said, you can really find it across anything. But today I want to look at how we responded to the massacre against the Jewish community in Bondi by upping our hate speech laws as a great example of a kind of myopic, useless, political-only fix that not only kicks the can further down the road in terms of the actual problem that's trying to solve, but probably exacerbates the nature of the problem as well. And not just that, but I want to talk about how it's part of a greater trend in Australia, but also across the world, where we're devaluing the importance of open exchange, open expression, and the much decried freedom of speech in a way that really does only end up impoverishing us further and getting us further away from our capacity to be able to solve the problems that we need to. And if you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you will know that some of those problems are urgent. If you're not, you might notice that there are urgent problems occurring in the world. Okay, so I'll get into it shortly, but first I want to say thanks so much to new patron Leanne M, who's joined up at the casual tier. Very glad to have you here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. And thanks so much, everybody, for voting on the upcoming topics. The poll is still open if you want to head over to patreon.com/Andrew. There are a lot of them tied, and I would love to have a few votes to break that, but I'm excited to get into those in the coming weeks. And a little reminder, because I know it can be a little bit inconvenient to go to listen to the extra episodes on Patreon rather than Spotify, YouTube, or wherever it is that you listen. But if you're a patron, there's an analysis I did last week on the catastrophe of the Iran war that, not to toot my own horn, but it's still relevant, and some of the ideas that I explore in that are only starting to be discussed now as the urgency of that all increases. So it's only 15 minutes or something like that. But if you're looking for a quick refresher on what's occurring there, I highly recommend jumping over to that and having a listen. But as for now, let's look at censorship in Australia and what it means and where it might go. So as all my Australian listeners will know, and many of my international listeners, there was a horrible incident in Australia on December 14th last year, where two men opened fired on a group of people celebrating Hanukkah at Bondi Beach in Sydney, and it left 15 people dead. And the response to this has really exposed a few problems simultaneously, and I'm not sure how to scaffold them, but one of them I want to start by saying is that it was surprising and disappointing to me how much of the discourse following that, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, but it is still always surprising when, rather than describe things as they are, we fall into platitudes and fall into, that kind of US-style hopes and prayers, try to soothe the feelings speech. And I get it, because it's a horrible thing and everyone has to sort of process it simultaneously. And it is a rare thing in Australia, I should add, thankfully. But one thing that really surprised me was how much of the language from our political leadership was this is an attack on all of us, and this is un-Australian, and this is not what being Australian is about, and all that sort of stuff. And I find that so annoying. Like, again, I get why they do it, and I understand that there's a utility to it, but I find it so annoying because when you rob reality of its best description, you rob people of the capacity to understand what's occurring, understand the problems, and then offer useful solutions. So if you think that what occurred there was an attack against all Australians, then you're missing the very obvious fact that it was an attack against Jewish Australians very explicitly. And similarly, if you think that there's an attack against Jewish Australians because some people are just racist, then you are ignoring the very ugly consequences and inevitable hate that's generated by the actions of a Jewish state done in the name of Jewish people at the moment. And it's immediately murky, and I feel sensitive even just saying those things, but I think I'm describing what's occurred. Even in my awkward thumbed way off the top of my head, I still think it's far better to try and deal in things in the terms of reality, because then you can respond to them. And that's kind of a precursor to where I think I wanted today's conversation to go, because fundamentally, if you can't talk about things truthfully, then you can't process them, test them, understand them, share them, and you get all these distortions that occur. And instead of responding to kind of a true, or at least as true as you can get, map of reality in terms of the exchanges that we have and representations of what we think is occurring in the world, you get the distorted funhouse and respond to that distorted funhouse mirror and build askew ideas and whatever. And you kind of just build a rickety world that kind of inevitably is more vulnerable to collapse. So that, in a nutshell, is a ham-fisted metaphor for why freedom of speech is really important for being able to understand things. And what occurred in response to that massacre was, I would say, a very typical, as I said at the top, a very typical contemporary political solution, which is, well, goodness, this is a complex problem with deep roots, many of which are completely out of our control. We're the government, we need to be seen to be doing something. Here's something, let's do it. And what they did was they pushed through very quickly the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Act in the federal parliament. And that had the function of strengthening federal hate speech laws, increasing penalties for inciting violence, and giving new powers to target hate groups and revoke visas for those who are spreading hate. Like, that's all well and good in how it sounds, because why wouldn't you want to outlaw hate? And of course you want to combat anti-Semitism. But the problem with this stuff in reality is that the target of this legislation, hatred and division and ideas of violence, they don't live exclusively in words that are expressed between people in the public sphere. And that's what's targeted. And going one step further, in a lot of state jurisdictions, you have seen in the last few years, and particularly post the attacks, escalations in banning symbols that are associated with certain kinds of extremism. And so the swastika is banned, and really notably, the most recent one is in Queensland. The expression "from the river to the sea" has been banned and comes with a potential 2-year jail term for using it. And comparing this to the US, where you've got your First Amendment rights going all the way back to 1790 or something, where in that society they have a strong tradition of having protected freedom of speech. We not only have that in Australia, but this is quite explicitly the opposite. And I am sorry to say that not only do I think it fails to do the job that it's trying to do, but it shrinks the space of the kind of discourse that you need to be able to have in public, to be able to map people's positions on various problems and to be able to understand contested realities and to address them. And I'm not saying that it's really obvious to me that everybody should be able to walk down the street carrying a swastika to best address the problems that the nation has at hand. But I think it's naive. I think it's naive in the extreme to suggest that because swastikas have been made illegal, that now means that nobody will have sympathy with Third Reich ideas, or that they can't find other banners to rally around, or that they can't meet each other and have little secret hate clubs or whatever it might be. So that's a failure to do what it says on the box. But furthermore, by pushing that stuff underground and sending a message of this is the type of thing that's forbidden for you to do, you inevitably kind of give an upvote to the type of behavior, I feel like much in the same way as When they made smoking illegal and dangerous and all that stuff, you get an uptick in smokers amongst teenagers who are trying to rebel because it's like, oh, well, this is against the rules and whatever, rather than merely just being something that could be treated on its terms. I think we're already seeing that with the overreach of the Queensland government to ban the phrase from the river to the sea. Like, regardless of what you think about that phrase and its implications and its usage and the people who are using it and whatever, like the full spectrum of it. On the one hand, you might think, well, that's dumb and ignorant and people shouldn't think that or say that and it's hateful to say that. Bad luck. People are going to think it anyway and they'll find other phrases to express that. And unfortunately, you have to have the capacity to be, if this is what you think, dumb and ignorant in public, to be able to have discourse as a society. Because guess what? Whoever you are, you have dumb and ignorant ideas too, and you should be allowed to express them so that they can be challenged or so they can be spoken of, and so that we can build a world that's reflective of the ideas of the people who are within it. But then at the other end of the spectrum, maybe it's a really important thing to be able to communicate, and then being banned from being able to say it doesn't stop you from holding that sentiment. Likely, it only makes you double down and find other ways to express it and to feel alienated by the state that's telling you that you can't speak and say the things that you think, that you legitimately think. It feels very much like the type of response that happens in a society like Australia as a kind of first reach tool in the grab bag, because we have a colonial mindset overhang where we expect to be told what to do and like being told what to do much, much more than other societies. And we expect the government to solve our problems. And also, we have a conflict averse society. So I think it naturally sits more comfortably for people to think that the government can make these determinations around what we can say and do rather than expecting to have to challenge something in public that you don't like. It also dangerously feeds into this weird idea that we should be protected from things that are offensive to us. And like, I really do get that there are extremes where, it's one thing to be on the radio saying, go to the beaches and let's take action against the Lebanese people. Like that's explicit incitement of hatred. And, we deserve to have protections against that stuff. But where we reduce it to symbols and phrases and even ideological expressions as being inherently dangerous, it's kind of, not only is it patronizing, I don't know if you find it to be patronizing, I find it to be very patronizing, which I hate. But it's also kind of, it's so murky that it's kind of impossible to do smoothly or consistently, because the meaning of word symbols and their usages change. So specific laws are never going to be watertight in covering off that stuff. And also, we don't all have a uniform ranking of what the problems in society are, or what the problems of history are, or what the threats that we want to protect against are. And because we don't have an even hierarchy, it means that we just kind of get the government kind of picking winners or picking losers in this case. And that inevitably generates kind of uneven legislation and rules that, if you feel like you're on the wrong side of them as a citizen, it just delegitimizes the whole thing. And so waters down the meaning of your law and government kind of, I think, needlessly, because not only is it not achieving the first thing of like getting rid of the hate, it's also then pushing people who might just be mildly disaffected on like over the edge to more radical positions, and more radical positions that instead of having their own little racist position, they now have the little racist position, and they think that the very existence of the governing structures they live under are illegitimate and targeting them. Just to pick another easy example that's at hand, there was that Dissent bar in Canberra, and I should disclose I'm friends with the owner, Dave. But I like to think that even if I wasn't, I think I'd be pretty upset that he was treated in this way. What he did was he hung up some posters with swastikas on them, and those swastikas were attached to parody images of Elon Musk, Donald Trump, JD Vance, Netanyahu, and Vladimir Putin. And, it's a political statement by an artist to say that we are residing, I guess, under the rule of men whose callous policies and enthusiastic entry into wars is akin to Nazism. And, it's not even like my bag. I don't even like that type of artwork. But who liked it even less was the ACT police, who came in and seized the posters and said, this is a crime scene, and shut it down for a night. And then they weren't able to get a case up because there was a big public outcry, but they still, even in responding to the non-case that they treated the situation with, they said that the posters did qualify for hate speech under the current legislation because of the presence of swastikas. And like, if you can't understand the difference between that and the actual anti-Semitism that exists, then you're an idiot. And if our state systems can't understand that, then of course they're going to be out there perpetrating what can only be seen as violations of what should be people's enshrined rights to be able to express themselves and have public discourse with each other around things. Because of course you could post those images online to no consequence. In fact, you could post it to your Instagram and probably more people would see them than walking past a bar in Civic. But we just have these absurd, uneven consequences when we have these attempts. Just on a personal note, it really shits me off because I walked past a house where I used to live in O'Connor, where they proudly hung the hammer and sickle in a flag out the front of their window. And it always crossed my mind that, like, I've got ancestors that were tortured under that banner. I've got ancestors that were disappeared under that banner into gulags and, never came back. And I never thought, I should call the police and shut this person down because they think something that's different to me. Like, I never had the sense that that person was even saying, like, we should put Chris's grandparents in the gulags. Like, it's clearly not what that person was saying. They just have a particular view on the world and, good on them. I happen to disagree with them, but guess what? I disagree with basically everyone about almost everything. Is that a crime? It shouldn't be. And much in the same way, I'm a little more radical in my appetite for these things. But I think that if you have morons who think that we should somehow reconstitute the Third Reich in Australia, and there'll be 11 of them marching down the street wearing swastikas, have at it. It's certainly offensive and it's certainly bad. But do you know what also is offensive? Living under a government that for most of my life has taken asylum seekers and taken them intentionally to extrajudicial processing centres where they are placed, so they are intentionally robbed of the rights of the law that the citizens and other asylum seekers would have, where they can end up spending years imprisoned without options. Like, that's offensive, and that's an actual deed. And it's not just a deed that I'm walking past 15 people who have the wrong idea about. It's a deed that 30% of my money that I earned is going towards paying for. And that's not even the most egregious thing that our state does. I mean, right now, like, there were Australian submariners as guests on that US submarine that sunk the Iranian ship that was unarmed, going back in ceremonial formation from India a few weeks ago, where they also didn't rescue the sailors that they fired into the sea, and 100-something people died. Like, that stuff is pretty egregious. And for me, is by my own personal value set in a hierarchy of things that I put as a much higher party foul than wearing an offensive pin. And yeah, I'm getting heated talking about this because I think it's ridiculous. And, I'm obviously not going to be the only one that has this response. And if you are there was that young woman who was wearing a From the River to the Sea t-shirt at a protest in Brisbane who got arrested. Do you think that she entered the criminal justice system thinking, oh, well, I now see the error of my ways and I will atone for my thought crimes? Much more likely she's going to be, fuck you, Queensland, fuck you, State of Queensland, fuck you, police, never trust these systems again. And furthermore, double down on her advocacy for an independent Palestinian state, which is ultimately what that phrase in its most common expression means. It doesn't, and I don't want to speak for other people, but I would suggest that there will be very few people who think we need to have a liquidation of the Jewish people from the nation of Israel. And I'm not saying that there aren't people that do think that, but I would even posit that there are more and more people who think that than ever, as part of the dance of the social discourse that occurs around not having honest conversations and honest representations of what is occurring in the world and how we navigate it. So yes, it's a lot to know what to do with. And that is exactly why I guess we pick up these shorthand tools and try to fix problems in a way that, by my measurement, makes them worse. And the surprising thing is, for me, how little pushback there is to this stuff at that sort of rights level. I mean, you get it from the libertarians and you get it from, again, the fringe class of like sovereign citizens or more classical liberals within the conservative movement. And of course, you get it from those disaffected by particular legislation. But I'm not seeing a strong movement generally towards the idea that we should have at least some minimum threshold for protected speech so that we can have complex discourse around problems that are going to have people arguing and people feeling really bad in a result of those conversations, which is quite striking because these are rights to which people have put their lives sort of in different parts of the world through history. And I also don't even get the sense that there's a strong reputational risk that's coming from this. And I think it's one of those things where I talked about a couple of weeks ago how if you consider yourself to be inherently virtuous around a particular topic, that it kind of buys you the shade to commit crimes in that area. I think that because there's this general idea that the West is the home of free speech and liberty and dialogue and freedom and whatever else, that we have all these shorthands that aren't necessarily protected, that we can then act with impunity without having that challenge our identity of ourselves. So this is all pretty intense. So I want to give you a lighter-hearted example of censorship that exists in Australia. And that is you can't call your kids whatever you want. Yeah, it might surprise you that most countries in the world have some explicit rules about what you can and can't call your kids. And that range from, Iceland, we have to call them names from the Elf Book, to the US, where you've got pretty free reign. I mean, it's state by state, but there are some states that don't even require you to submit a name to the state at all. But in Australia, there's actually quite a fun list of things that you can't call your kid. You can't call them titles and ranks. So you can't call your kid Admiral, Baron, Captain, Colonel, Duke, Emperor, etc., etc. Queen, Saint, Satan, or Vice Admiral. Why would you give your kid a subservient rank? Anyway, you can't call them religious figures and terms like God, Goddess, Jesus Christ, Dalai Lama, etc. You can't call them offensive or obscene words. Someone was rejected for calling their kid scrotum, smelly, shithead, bonghead, ranger. You can't call them pop culture or brands: Harry Potter, RoboCop, Facebook, IKEA, iMac, and Anzac. And you can't call them misleading or administrative terms such as passport, Medicare, Nazi, terrorist, and names that are statements like Jake is amazing or save Mother Earth. And I love that people try. It's the same with number plates as well. They censor those. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the genre, but there's always chuckleheads who try and sneak through personalized number plates as being about something innocuous, but sneaking through something filthy. There was one I saw which was love tofu, as in love to fur. And there are other ones, but you can complain against them and they'll get taken away. Anyway, so that's a lighter-hearted censorship that's occurring. But perhaps the most alarming element of this general trend against liberal freedom of expression is that we really probably do need to have more robust systems and a more robust baseline understanding of what our society is for in the face of a lot of the technologies that are going to come in, because already, as our public forum is less and less letters to the editor in the Sydney Morning Herald and more comment sections of Facebook and under Instagram posts, we really risk defaulting the terms of engagement of our public sphere as being just whatever the terms of engagement are of the various tech giants and their user terms. And for very obvious reasons, those are not the same thing. They don't represent the same interests, and they don't allow the same safeguards. So even separate to explicit censorship, even just a thumb placed on the scales of algorithmic distribution can significantly alter the information that you receive, and you may get the impression that the collective thinks a certain way when they don't, and we're herd animals, and that stuff is important to us and does shape our thinking. And also, ultimately, if we're to aspire to have a democracy, I mean, it's very obvious that having good information and a good flow of information is an essential part of that, because if you're to vote in your own interests, you need to know what those interests are. And if you're to vote for things, you need to know what they mean. And if, as is quite likely, there'll be a cohort in the next generation of political leadership of Australia who have spent their time on the streets waving banners that say from the river to the sea, I would much rather live in a world where that was an interrogated statement that came with a conversation rather than handcuffs, because wouldn't it be great to know the exact terms under which people meant certain things, rather than to just assume that anything that might be read as offensive must be treated as the slippery slope to genocide. And that's also not to forget the kind of silent evidence of these types of policies, which is that they result in people not expressing themselves if they think certain things, which is also in a democracy a terrible thing to have, and not just because of the ideal of people being represented in whatever they think, but also but that important flow of information in that you need to have the perspectives that people genuinely have represented on the table, particularly because they might represent a truth somewhere that could be going missing if people are self-censoring from the public sphere. And the thing that always annoys me the most is, again, on the next generation of political leadership, whatever that looks like, I hate the idea that public office will only be available to those people who knew from the age 14 that they wanted to be Emperor of the World, Prime Minister of Australia, etc. And so they didn't post anything controversial on social media. And that all these people who maybe have been testing their ideas and not have had that aspiration to power, but have had that aspiration to discourse and made mistakes along the way, leave themselves vulnerable to being challenged or even arrested now, when it could be the case that those people are much better suited to interrogating and understanding reality than people who are just doing a really good job of playing the game of not causing any trouble or bringing any attention to themselves. Negative attention. Now, I'm aware that I have a kind of outlier attitude with this stuff generally, where I have a pretty high appetite for encountering people that I don't like and not being offended by them. Or sorry, rather, I can encounter people who have opinions that I find disgraceful and not reject those people themselves. And in fact, I find very much that my taste or distaste, rather than being around the opinions themselves, much more surrounds the capacity for those people to allow challenges to their ideas or dissent. I find it much easier to sit with somebody I disagree with and can have a conversation with about that than someone I broadly almost completely agree with, but there's a brittleness in being able to discuss points of difference. And I think ultimately that's what has to be valorized, because the problems that we face aren't just a matter of, well, let's make sure we don't offend anybody, or let's make sure nobody's feelings are hurt, or let's make sure that people aren't hating each other by criminalizing that, because the consequences are really important. It is really important that we don't hate each other, and it is really important that we don't go down the slippery slopes of division and dehumanization and all those things. I think it's a Martin Luther King idea, which is where you find people that you disagree with, try and have the principle of widening the rope and including them in, have your ideas be ones that can include more people and allow for more genuine diversity of conversation and ideation. Because if you go down the narrow path of declaring what is and isn't allowed to be thought and expressed, particularly if it's done by government, who are not well positioned to make those determinations at all, then you impoverish your own society, and you ironically end up creating those divisions as those who are on the outside of whatever the laws might be further entrench themselves or feel disenfranchised or no longer see the collective as legitimately representative of them, and find other modes of expression, which can range all the way from small acts of rudeness to organized violence at scale. And yeah, our problems are too important to treat trivially and to incorrectly equate symbolism and shorthand phrases as representative of their whole nature. Ideally, down the line, I would personally like to see some explicit enshrining within a constitution of Australia for the capacity to have the pursuit of liberal conversation and freedom of expression across all lines in there, even just as a value statement, so that it could be something to hold up to and say, look, ultimately, we do want to be able to have difficult conversations, and ultimately, we do want to be able to represent the different positions that people have. Because I can see, as the world is getting a little bit more tense, if you hadn't noticed, and that tension coming in tandem with a kind of tech panopticon, which affords tools for control of speech and idea flow that weren't available previously by some scale. The temptation will be there to encroach increasingly upon the kind of free exchanges that we have broadly taken for granted. And I guess with this stuff, it's a lot easier to lose things than it is to get them back. I'm not seeing an assumption in the US that all the rights that they lost with the Patriot Act after 9/11 should be returned. And I'm not seeing any instinct that privacy will be anything like 2027 as it was in 1997. So these things ultimately do matter. And as I said earlier, not just for the feel-good idea of, well, it's nice to be in a world where everyone can say what they want, but for the meta level, which is no individual entity, even a great government led by intelligent people with full information, is going to have the capacity to understand the whole of existence. And so you do need to have people banding about ideas, and you do need people to be able to be wrong. And you need people to be able to be wrong in offensive ways too, unfortunately. to be able to navigate reality. And so hopefully that's something that we can get enshrined, or at least in the meantime, something you can take away as a cultural value if you agree with what I'm saying. If you don't, I hope the government comes and arrests you, puts you in the slammer. No, if you do agree with what I'm saying, then carry it around as a value and an expectation, and hold it up to other people in the same way. And we can build the world that we want, which is, of course, shorthand for you go out there and build the world that I want, because I'm too busy cooking, eating, walking in the forest now and then. It's great. Speaking of great, thanks so much for listening to the end. I'm going to be on to the Patreon topic starting next week, so keep your eyes peeled and your thumbs subscribed and clicked on up wherever you're watching this from. If you do enjoy the podcast generally, please send it to a friend. Best way to make it grow, and the more it grows, the better I feel and the better quality the episodes can become as I get more time and resources to put into on exactly that. Thank you so much to my Patreon patrons. Love you guys as always. Welcome again, Leanne M. A joy to have you on board. Take care, and I'll see you next week.